Hello, welcome to my latest gun repair video. Now, those of you who've watched my channel before may have seen a couple of videos about this little Remington Model 12 rifle. I had a general introduction to it. I also had a video about replacing the firing pin because the firing pin was broken when I bought it. Now, at the end of that video when I did this shooting, you may have noticed I had a couple of misfires. Other than that, the rifle shoots fine, it cycles fine, everything's fine, but I'm probably getting about one misfire in every 20 shots. Regardless of the type of ammo, both with federal standard velocity and also the little 22 CCI high velocity shorts that I loaded up with for rapid fire, hit 14 of them in it. So there's obviously still a minor issue with this rifle. It seems to be causing light strikes on the primers, on the rims. Now that could be due to a couple of different things. It could be excessive headspace. Someone wrote in a comment on one of my other videos and said they had one of these and the actual locking shoulder for the bolt inside the receiver was bruised and causing excessive headspace, and he was able to pin the metal back in place to improve the headspace, and that fixed the problem. Now I've looked at this, and this rifle looks like it's done very fine, even though it's fairly worn and it has got quite a patina. It doesn't look like it's had a lot of work internally. It's very, very crisp inside. It's very tight. You can sort of see in the Tasmanometer, you can see there's sort of no movement in the breech block at all when I'm wiggling this. It's nice and tight, tightly locked. And when you cycle it, you can just feel everything's tight. So I think what's going on with this rifle, and I've seen it before in this type of rifle, being a hammerless design, over the 80 or 90 years of its life, people tend to come home after shooting. Of course, you clear your rifle. Of course, it's cocked now. People know not to dry fire rim fires, so they tend to just put them in the cupboard like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's spent a large percent of its 80 or 90 year life sitting in the cupboard being cocked, and that just causes a weakness in the mainspring. Of course, with this one, I always pull it apart and actually decock it manually before putting it away for that reason. And just like I use snap caps in all my hammerless shotguns, before I put them away, I let the hammers down by firing them on a snap cap. So anyway, what I'm planning to do is I'm planning to look at replacing the mainspring on this rifle and see if that'll improve things. So first thing we'll do is pull it to pieces. Alright, so I didn't bother filming it, but I took the gun apart and I took the stock off. That just involves taking the butt plate off and then just using a big screwdriver like this with a plain blade down the hole. There's quite a big slot in the screw, and you can unscrew the screw and carefully take the butt plate off. In my case, then take this butt off, I mean. Alright, so here we've got the mainspring. So I've actually let the hammer down here now. So you can see there's the mainspring. Bears against this little bit here, part of the kind of what I suppose you call the trigger assembly. Hammer pivots here, and you've got a pin here. And you can see the pin's under even now. It's under slight tension. Not a huge amount of tension, I must say, but slight tension. So when you're looking at coil springs, there's three different things you've got to look at when replacing it. There's the diameter of the wire, there's the outside diameter of the spring, and there's the actual, well actually rather than being the length of the spring, because that can vary depending on how worn or whether it's lost its set, but the actual number of coils. So before I go any further in pulling this apart, I'm going to just check, and we're going to measure this and see if I've got a spring that's likely to be suitable. Alright, so I just measured this spring as well as I could. The external diameter is 0.325 inches. Now it's a bit difficult to actually accurately measure the wire size because I can't really get the caliper over a full loop of wire, but just kind of holding it and eyeballing it, I reckon it comes out to about 0.043, something like that, 0.043. So what I'll do now is I'll go and get my wire stocks, my spring stocks, and we'll have a look at them and see what we can find. Now I've generally found in American firearms when I've had to replace springs that they tend to be fairly standard sizes. Now I've got this spring kit from Brownell, so and they're all imperial sizes, so I was kind of quite expecting to find a spring that was pretty well the same diameter and wire diameter as the one in the rifle, but I was surprised and a bit disappointed to find it wasn't the case. The only one that was near it, you can see that bigger spring in there, it's quite a bit bigger diameter wire, it's about 0.56 or something like that. 0.5 is actually, it's this one, it'd be this one, this biggest one here, 0.058, and it's about 0.3, well there you go, that'll be that biggest size, 0.312, so it's too thick a wire and it's not quite, it might work, the diameter might work, obviously it has to go over that central guide rod. So yeah, I don't want to put one that's too heavy in there because it would just put too much stress on everything in the rifle. In an old rifle, it's not a good idea. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to just put it in the two hard basket for a minute. I know kind of what size spring I need, and I'm going to have to start having a bit of a look around and see if I can find. Sometimes the hardware stores actually have an assortment of springs, so I'll see if I can find one that's a little bit more suitable to do this job. And I'll look in the Brownell's catalogue too, so I might order some stuff from Brownell shortly, so I'll just see if there's any other springs that they've got. Alright, so I've knocked the little pin out where this hammer spring strut connects to the hammer, and then this hollow pin, I've knocked it. You knock it all the way out, but I managed to knock it just most of the way so it's still in its hole, so I'll just leave it there. And you'll find the hammer will then come straight out, and just make a note of which way this bottom block thing goes for when you put it back in again. But they just come straight out, it's all very straightforward. Now, you can see I've still got that strut with the compressed spring captive using my little pin at the end. Now just be aware that this spring is under tension. Just be aware if you pull that pin out, it's going to go shooting across the room like a spear, the pin and the spring. So what I tend to do is hold it like this. I put a pin punch in that end hole there, and you can actually use your thumb against the bit that's going across and puts enough pressure on. It's maybe not even a bad idea to put a rag or something over the top just to capture it if it boings out. Then you can take the tension off that spring, the spring will come out, or the whole thing will come out. And then replacing the spring is just the reverse. Thread it through, and then you have to kind of compress the spring without it bending until you can get that to protrude through the end, and then you just put your pin through, and then it's just a matter of putting it all back together again. And now the other thing is, down in there, I'll see if I can show it to you. See down in the bottom of the receiver there's a little hole. Well, that's where the trigger return spring goes. I've got it here, but I haven't got enough hands. I'll just put it in now. Alright, there's the trigger return spring sitting in its little thing. So just be careful you don't lose that during disassembly, and make sure it's in place during assembly. A little tab on the end of that bottom block thing just pushes down on that. Alright, there we go. I've got it back together again. So yeah, just got to check that you've got the block on the spring properly. You can tell that, see how that's actually got spring tension. So that's actually the tension from that little spring that's inside the trigger, and it also acts as the trigger spring too. So if I decock this, there's a slight spring tension on the trigger, so that then it'll catch the sear as the hammer comes back like that. So you just got to check that everything's in place. That other little, see that little spring there, that's actually held on with a screw at the back. That's actually a buffer spring just for when that's what the breech block hits when it gets to the back of its travel, just to stop it smashing into the frame. I suspect that spring's lost a bit of its set because it's sort of hard up against the frame. It probably should sit out, but I don't think it's worth mucking around with that. I think just leave it as is. There's no reason to take it off. While I'm here, just mention I didn't take it off, but if we cock the hammer Then we've got our safety, it's got a detent safety there. So that actually, there is a pin comes from the top. I think you can take that apart, there's a detent system in there, but again, if it's working, maybe put a bit of oil in there, but otherwise leave it alone. That's the pin there that holds the detent, see there? That little pin there. But yeah, I'd just leave it alone. So yeah, so replacing that spring didn't actually improve the misfiring problem. So I've actually put the original spring back in again now. But the other springs seem to be fine, and they seem to have about the same amount of tension. So, but I thought, well, I might as well just leave the original one in there if it's doing its job. So what I've got to look at now is the breech block. So I'm just sitting here looking at this breech block and this firing pin, trying to work out why it's not imparting enough force on the rim of the case. I can see a few things just looking at it. If I push that so it's level with the back of the breech block, you can see that firing pin protrusion. Now with the correct headspace, that should be enough to dent the case adequately, but it's obviously not. Now this does have, like, it's held in place by pins through the slot. One thing I do notice, see in that little slot there, you can see where I suspect as the hammer's hitting, it's actually pushing the firing pin laterally a bit, and you can see in that little slot there, you can see some little dimples where the firing pins have been bashing into that pin. See that? And that's possibly slowing it down. It almost seems like this firing pin's a bit soft, because if I look at, I mean, I've only fired a few hundred rounds through this since I replaced the firing pin probably. Here you can see how bruised the back of that firing pin is there. So that's kind of shortened its effective length. And there, and it's catching, see that? I think one thing I can do is take the firing pin out and file that part of where there's little dimples where it's been obviously, and you can see it's hitting on one side, which suggests that the firing pin's been kind of torqued. See that there? See, it's actually quite rough, and I suspect as it's coming forward, it's kind of catching on those and then not coming out far enough, just going bang and hitting like that. And that's what I'll do. I'll file that little flat area there so it's smooth again, and we'll put it back together and see if we get a better primer strike on it. So I fired that little slot in the firing pin and put it back together again, and I've fired probably a couple of hundred rounds since then, and you can see it's actually formed more little dents in there, again just sort of showing how soft the metal of this firing pin is, but you can see it's no longer really catching like it was before. So I think there was just not quite enough room in that slot, so as the firing pin came forward and hit and formed the little ridges, it was just tending to get caught. But you can see now it moves quite freely. So you'll be glad to know, since I did those repairs, that I haven't had any misfires in this rifle. So to sum up, basically, because I replaced the new firing pin when it was still misfiring, remembering that I'd never actually ever fired this. I bought this rifle with a broken firing pin, so I'd never fired it before I actually replaced the firing pin. Once I'd replaced the firing pin and it was still having the odd misfire, I assumed it was probably due to a weak mainspring. But, you know, I replaced the mainspring and it was still misfiring. It didn't make any difference. And it was only then that I looked at that, had another look at the block and the firing pin, and I noticed those two issues with the firing pin. Now, by filing that little notch, that seems to have solved the problem, and possibly some of that
the firing pin's obviously a little bit soft, but that peening on the end of the firing pin may have been exacerbated by the fact that as it was going forward, it was getting jammed where that little notch was, and so the firing pin wasn't absorbing the blow from the hammer by moving forward. Because since I fixed that, I've probably fired a couple of hundred rounds through it, and I haven't had a single misfire, and it's still going fine. Because I was sort of suspecting that the back of the firing pin might get more and more peen to the point where it wouldn't actually go into the breech block. But I'm keeping that in the back of my mind. All I did with the back of the firing pin was just, I put it on a hard surface and just gave it a little tap with a hammer and just moved that metal back in place. But I do have the option of case hardening the back of the firing pin just to harden it up if I have to. But at this point I haven't bothered because it's been going okay. So there you have it. So this little rifle is going really well now. That's about all for today. So until next time, thanks for watching.